So I would like to start with our acknowledgement of country. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the traditional owners of this beautiful country. This event is being brought to you in partnership with Miley Community Libraries and Latrobe City Libraries and East Gippsland Libraries. And welcome to our guests and our partners and of course our audience for this evening. We ask that everybody keep your microphones on mute and your cameras off, preferably for the session. At the end of tonight's interview, we have a short time for question and answer, which I'm sure will be really, really good tonight. So we ask that you put your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. You can type them in at any time through the interview and we'll keep track of them and put them to Claire and Katrina at the end of the interview. Let's introduce Katrina. Katrina Kell, what a pleasure to have you tonight. Katrina is an award-winning Australian author. Her forthcoming and hot off the presses historical novel Chloe, Revolution, Art and Intrigue in Bohemian Paris was inspired by one of Australia's most iconic paintings created by artist Jules Joseph Le Beauvais. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. In Paris in 1875 and has graced the walls of our Melbourne's Younger Jackson Hotel since 1909. Katrina's catalogue of work includes short stories and poetry, essays and young adult novels, and most recently the winner of an Australian Society of Authors Awards mentorship for the unpublished manuscript of Chloe. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And very recently published by Echo Publishing. I have a copy of the book here with us. I've got the blurry filter on, so it's hard to see, but the beautiful Chloe. It's an amazing, amazing cover. Hot off the presses. Our copies for the libraries are still currently on order, but they are coming in. But I know it's available as an ebook with BorrowBox, so you can jump on and grab that ebook and pop a hold on the other book as well. And introducing the lovely Claire Halliday. Thank you, Claire. Claire is a freelance writer and journalist whose work appears regularly in Australian newspapers and magazines. And she's the author of 5 non-fiction books. She's a copywriter, ghostwriter, and podcaster, and is currently at work on 2 books, which I'd love to find out where you're at with all of that as well, Claire.
Having a headache. Just
yes,
overwhelm is the answer.
All right, I'm going to hand over to our lovely host for this evening. And pop your questions in the chat box. Enjoy the evening, everybody.
Thank you.
I'm happy to give you an update later, but for now, our focus is Katrina Kell, who is our feature author, and we are talking about Chloe. And thanks to everybody for coming and joining us tonight, and thanks to the collaboration between the libraries for making this possible. As Kelly said, we are going to invite questions, so anytime you think of something, just pop it in because we'll come to them towards the end. Welcome, Katrina.
Hello, and thank you for having me. This is a pleasure. Lovely opportunity.
I have been in Melbourne for a very, very long time, about 35 years, but the first 20 years of my life, I've just given my age away. I grew up in Adelaide. So when I came to Melbourne, the legend of the Chloe painting was very real to me. It was this iconic pub in the city. It was a hugely famous or infamous, depending on who you spoke to, watering hole in the Melbourne CBD. But I remained ignorant about the painting really until what you've created, which has been quite a revelation to me, which is a bit shocking because as a journalist, I do love digging into things, but I've never really dug into that. And in my mind, I think because of the association with the pub, I kind of saw it as just like a curio that was hanging on the wall, and perhaps other people have seen it that way too, and not actually recognised it for its artistic credibility, which, like I said, was new to me, rather shamefully. So what can you tell us about the history of Chloe in terms of its standing in the art world back in the day when it was actually painted?
Yes, and you're not alone, by the way, in having that sort of impression of Chloe. I think it's like one of those situations of something's being on your doorstep. And I think for a lot of Melburnians, it's just, oh yeah, Chloe. I think as someone from somewhere else, maybe that's why that curiosity really was there, to try and dig a bit deeper. And yeah, so Chloe was created in the winter of 1874-75 in Paris by Jules Joseph Lefebvre. And at the time, it was exhibited in the 1875 Paris Salon. And there's been quite a bit of misunderstanding. A lot of the stories around Chloe say it won the gold medal at the Paris Salon, which it didn't actually, because Jules Lefebvre had already won so many medals. He was no longer eligible as far as the competition went. He was sort of far above that. So he would exhibit out of contest. And Chloe received amazing reviews at the time. She was very, very well received. Very interesting thing, because the previous year, Jules Lefebvre had exhibited a very controversial painting of the Prince Imperial, the son of the deposed emperor, and had got himself into quite a lot of hot water. And so Chloe was almost like a little bit of a chance to redeem himself by going back to his more traditional, beautiful nudes, academic nudes that he was very famous for. And at the time, there was quite a bit of discussion in the press, even around that controversy, because he had another painting at the time that kind of still revealed, it was called The Dream, but it still kind of revealed his Bonapartist longings for a restoration. So it's a fascinating story even about the artist who created Chloe. And Paris was still very much recovering from the Franco-Prussian War and the terrible events of the Paris Commune, and so many Parisians having been slaughtered by their own government in a very short period of time. It was during a period when Impressionism was definitely on the rise, but was still very much on the outskirts of the art community and was quite often being sort of publicly ridiculed. So there were definitely very active Impressionists, but the academic paintings were still kind of ruling the roost at that time. So I guess that gives you a little bit of background in terms of the art history of the painting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to dig more into the person in the painting, but we'll get to that soon. What I want to stay on for now, though, is you, because the origin story of this painting is fascinating enough to me. Just the way that connections are made in your life with the painting and how you felt like you were drawn to it. But even just then, you mentioned the artist and you were listing off the paintings that they painted. And one of them you said, I think, was called The Dream. Now, this actually
I just made that connection.
You only just made it too? Yeah, because I was just thinking,
Yes.
on a minute, did she mean to say that? Because your whole inspiration for digging into Chloe actually came to you in a dream. We're going to get a bit woo-woo now, people, but stay with us. Tell us about this dream.
I know, it's extraordinary. I've never had a dream like it before or since. And it was quite a lucid dream. So, one of those strange dreams where you're dreaming, but you're kind of very much aware of it, of what's happening within that dream. And in the dream, I had this very vivid sense of myself sitting in a very comfortable armchair, something probably from the 19th century. And I was reading quite a large volume, a leather-bound book. And on the cover was the title of the book, and it was called Chloe's Child. And then I noticed that my name was on the cover as the author of this book. And I opened the book, and as I opened the book and started reading it, a sulphur-crested cockatoo flew down and landed on the pages of the book. And at that point in the dream, this kind of very strange forest sort of grew up around me. And I woke up and I thought, how bizarre, as you would, having such a strange dream. And it just would not leave me. This dream would not leave me, because I thought, this is so strange, to dream that you've actually written a book about Chloe. And in this case, Chloe's Child it was. And I didn't know anyone called Chloe. I had no recollection of anyone called Chloe at all. So I sort of pondered and worried over it all morning. And then just all of a sudden, it came back to me, this conversation that I had had many years before with a gentleman who I was dating at the time, who actually later became my first husband, who had just returned from Melbourne. And I was an art student at the time, and I'd been telling him all about my art studies. And he told me I must go and see Chloe in Melbourne, because he had seen Chloe, and he told me how this was this amazing academic painting and how it was in a very working class environment. last place you'd expect to see it, because you would normally see a painting like that in a gallery. And one of the things that really intrigued me about the story was he told me how protective these kind of rough and tumble drinkers were of Chloe. It was not like treated with any disrespect or anything. She was kind of, yeah, I guess in a sense, queen of that bar room. And so I immediately hopped onto my laptop and started Googling away and found an image of Chloe. And as soon as I saw that image, I just thought, yeah, I just got to find out who this girl is. It was that impression, you know, and it was the face much more than the nudity. As soon as I saw her face, I just thought there's so much going on.
What did you see and what did you find out? And did the two match from what your perception of how she had so much going on and who you actually found her to be?
I think so. I think very much so, because what I could see in that image was a lot of conflicted emotions going on in that young girl's face. If you have a really close look at Chloe, she looks really lost in lots of respects, but she also looks, just from my impressions, she looks quite annoyed. She looks quite frustrated, and certainly not, if you know the poem that's inspired the painting, which is a poem called Nacille et Chloé, by André Chénier, a very famous French poet. It's about a very playful poem. It's actually about a little flirtatious kind of interlude in this little grove near the spring. And to me, it didn't look anything like that. She looked much more troubled. Looked haunted, I guess, in a way. And that's what really intrigued me. And so, yes, when I started to immediately started researching around the history of that period, and when I saw what had been going on at the time she would have been, you know, growing up, I thought, yeah, I think there's a lot more to learn here.
So tell us about that, because I do want to, you know, find out how the painting got from France to the pub, because there were times in between when it did indeed hang in galleries. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But while we are talking about Chloe and the girl behind the face, the real girl behind it, what can you tell us about what you found out about that woman?
Yeah, well, it was very challenging because initially there was only very sketchy information available about her, and a lot of it was myth. There's been a lot of very colourful myths created about this young woman, whose name was actually Marie, and that's the name I use in the novel. But George Moore, the very famous Irish writer, he's the one that gave the initial clue, because he claimed to have known Marie. And he wrote about her in his Confessions of a Young Man, which was his memoir about his very early days in Paris as a young man, about 21 to sort of 30, when he was an art student at the Académie Julian. And he described Marie as Lefebvre's Chloe. And there's a little anecdote in there about his encounter with her and his description of her. And he actually talks about the story about her apparent demise, but doesn't throw really any light on it. You know, no one seemed to know what had happened. So that was interesting. And then I did a PhD while I was writing Chloe. Chloe, the original kind of manuscript of Chloe was a part of my PhD thesis. And so that allowed me to go to Paris and sort of dig and dive in amongst all the archives. And during that process, I actually was helped by a fantastic librarian who came up with an article that had been written by an American journalist, Lucy Hamilton Hooper, who had gone to Lefebvre's studio, and she was a big admirer of Chloe, and she saw the original sketch and asked a few questions about the model, because she was really, unusually for that time, she was very interested to learn about the model and who she was, who'd been part of this amazing, beautiful painting. And Lefebvre shared quite a bit of information about his model. He didn't share her name, but he said that she was a very elegant, very sensitive young woman, which, as he described it, was unusual for a person of her position, which immediately revealed that she was very likely a working class girl. And he said her ideals, her proportions were ideal. He'd hardly had to change anything in the photo, in the actual process of creating the painting. And he talked a lot about what had actually in what he had learned had happened to her. But he wasn't in Paris when it happened. So a lot of this information is all kind of secondhand information about what actually happened to her, which I don't want to go into too much detail about because I spoil the story.
Yeah, let's go back to the times that you're saying were swirling around her, because, you know, people look at the painting,
Yes.
get past that initial ignorance that I had, you know, which is just, oh, it's just a painting. And I guess because it's a nude and it's in a pub, there's kind of a bawdiness attached to it in a way, even though it's not at all that painting. But I think in some
true.
maybe that is. So then you move past that and you realize that this is actually, you know, a good painting, a great painting, some would say. But you still don't think of the political climate at the time and how that might have informed the painting and the artist. So what did you learn, you know, with your ear in the and your mind on the history research? What did you learn about that time?
Yes, and it was a particularly volatile period. So 1870, 71 Franco-Prussian War, France had a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Prussians. And it created a lot of animosity, particularly in Paris, because the Parisian people felt they had been betrayed by their government. Napoleon III had been deposed in 1870 after a very embarrassing defeat during the Franco-Prussian War, where he was actually captured, and so was his head Marshal MacMahon. And that was very embarrassing for France. So they basically deposed Napoleon III and set up a provincial government, which was supposed to be Republican. But as it turned out, very quickly became apparent that it was mainly being governed by monarchists and Bonapartists. Not so much Bonapartists at that time, but mainly monarchists and Orleanists. So the French public were getting very frustrated, and then it became apparent that their government was probably colluding with the Prussians as well. So that was what caused the rise of the Paris Commune. And that was a very powerful political movement, which actually managed to gain power for about 4 months through the local municipal elections. And it was very much driven by women as well. The women were very proactive in the formation of the Paris Commune. And at the time when the government decided to try and actually crush the revolution, it was actually the women who threw themselves on the cannon that they'd been, you know, the people in Montmartre and the sort of hill areas of Paris had been sort of storing up cannon with the hopes of defeating the Prussians still. And when the Versailles troops came to take them away, the women of Montmartre threw themselves on the cannon and actually managed to get a lot of the soldiers to actually turn and support the commune. So it's a real story of women's activism as well. And you'll have, having read the story, you'll have come across Louise Michel, is a character, so not a particularly prominent character in the novel, but she is an important character, and she was very instrumental in that revolution as well, and ended up being transported out to New Caledonia. So
I want to ask you a little bit more about the transition from, you know, approaching a PhD as a researcher with that, you know, focus on real history, and then how that comes to be a novel. But we'll go there in a minute, because now, after you've given us a nice little neat potted history of the times, you've told us about the artist, you've revealed the model and a little bit of her life. But how does such a painting then, by a celebrated artist, and such a large painting, it must be said also, make it from France to Melbourne in that time, and in a pub?
yes,
After
exactly.
several years of being
It's
here,
really,
around a little bit.
it is a really interesting journey that Chloe had at that time, because what was happening in Australia was very interesting at the time. So it was still a very new, you know, colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, of course. There was a lot of competition going on between those two colonies at the time. And they were really trying to launch themselves onto the world stage as, you know, being cultural centres and important centres, not only of culture, but also of industry and various other things. So they decided to hold these big international exhibitions, and Sydney beat Melbourne to it. They had an international exhibition in 1879. A little bit ill-prepared, but they managed to get it up and running, and Chloe was shipped by agents of Lefebvre's, was shipped out to Australia, to Sydney, for the big international exhibition, where she was displayed and won top honours for Lefebvre in his particular category. So that was her first kind of exhibition in Australia. And then the following year, at the 1880 Melbourne International Exhibition, which was a huge shebang, and they had had a lot more time to get ready, and they had the beautiful exhibition buildings constructed specifically for the exhibition. They had a French court, and Chloe was brought to Melbourne and displayed in the French court. And you can even, if you go onto Trove, there is actually an image of Chloe that you can find of her displayed in the French court at the 1880 International Exhibition, and once again won first-class honours. And then, following the exhibition, Sir Thomas Fitzgerald, who was then Dr. Thomas Fitzgerald, very famous surgeon and art collector, he purchased Chloe for his own art collection. And then he did something quite, probably quite standard for the day, but he lent the painting to the National Gallery of Victoria, where she was initially displayed in a fairly discreet spot in the gallery. And then the gallery decided to be democratic and open its doors on a Sunday so that working class people could come and view these beautiful artworks. And it was at that point in 1883 that this massive scandal erupted in the press. And there was all sorts of debates going on whether it was the propriety of having a painting like Chloe displayed on the Sabbath, this nude, and that these people that probably couldn't understand a painting like that were coming to see it. So it was very much a class war that was going on between the elites and the working class again over, you know, whether they were capable of understanding a beautiful artwork such as Chloe.
And with all that
very controversial.
And people covering, with all that swirling around and people covering their eyes in fright and everything, then it makes it to Adelaide, my home,
yes,
the city of churches, which is probably more uptight about such things back in those days.
Well, you would think so. You would think so. But as it turned out, based on my research, Chloe actually had a relatively uneventful time in Adelaide and had a much better reception, with the exception of the clergy. So there were quite a few irate letters written to the press with all sorts of aspersions, particularly being cast on the model of the painting, and why, saying this is why people shouldn't go and see it, because do you know this is this person is such and such. And these were all very interesting accounts from these clergymen, because I was very curious about where they had got this information from. And the only person I could think of that may have passed that information on was an artist called James Clark Waite, who actually came to Melbourne in the 1880s and became a very successful portrait artist. And he claimed to have known Chloe, or the model for Chloe, and made quite a tidy sum by painting replicas of this young woman and selling them at the time. After the big kerfuffle at the NGV, then Adelaide, then Fitzgerald actually displayed Chloe in his own home. But once again, that caused another scandal, because passing pedestrians could see the painting through his window, because his home was on Collins Street. So it was a very prominent building, and apparently Chloe was quite visible, so he had to remove her. And then she stayed in relative obscurity until Fitzgerald's death. And it was at that point that Henry Figsby Young, the very entrepreneurial publican, saw a great opportunity and purchased the painting and hung it in the saloon bar as an added attraction, which it definitely was.
But like you said, it's a strange thing when you think of it, you know, a pub, a painting, a prized painting.
Yes.
Yet the people of that pub have really been protective, I guess, in a way, of that painting.
Absolutely.
And they've had a really deep emotional connection to it. And we are going to talk more about the novelization of this, but great stories start with facts. And
yes, they
the
do.
facts about Chloe are so rich and beautiful. There's so many things we could talk about and fill our hour. I'm interested in the soldier's relationship with Chloe, the real painting Chloe, because that's something that you dug into. And I find it fascinating that, throughout world wars and the Vietnam conflict as well, you've got stories of soldiers writing to Chloe as if she's a real woman. And I guess she becomes that icon of what home means to them and that representation of their Melbourne home. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of accounts of that amazing connection that the soldiers had, and particularly the tradition that they would have of going and having a drink with Chloe. And it was like a good luck ritual that they would have. And the idea was they would have their drink with Chloe, and then when they came back from the war, they would come and have another drink with her. So it was almost like that sense of, cyclical thing. Yes, if we have a drink with Chloe, we've got to come back and have another drink with her. And so the other issue was at that particular period, particularly during World War I, many of those young men, and they were very young men that were going off to war, a lot of them, sometimes underage and whatever. So it was sometimes even the first opportunity these young boys would possibly have had of ever seeing a nude woman. So there was a big attraction in that as well. And because I went into the Trench War Museum in the Somme, and there's actually examples of the little sketches of nudes and things like that soldiers were drawing in the trenches and things like that. So it was obviously something that was very much on their mind, and being missed was this female part of their lives. It was huge. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think Chloe definitely represented that. I think there's a beautiful account that I came across, even a photograph that I discovered from the Vietnam War. And it's where there's this battalion of soldiers, and they had one of the local artists, and I don't know, they must have had a photo of Chloe with them, but he created their replica Chloe so that they could have her giant painting there in Vietnam with them while they were fighting. So it's all these extraordinary
Sort of
stories.
like when you go to Hoi An and get a suit made, they just had a
They had a
painting.
Chloe. They had a Chloe. Yeah. And then I don't know if you've heard the story about Ambon, the island of Ambon, and how the soldiers, it was Chloe who actually enabled them to finally be released from the Japanese prison of war camp, because they were interrogated by the radio operator after the end of the war to just try and establish they were genuinely Australian soldiers. And so the radio operator asked them, so what do you know about Melbourne? What's the most famous thing in Melbourne? And the guy said, Chloe, told him Chloe. And he said, where is she? He said, young Jackson's, take me to her. And that's when he was convinced that these guys were actually Australian soldiers, because there was a lot of confusion at that time, and they were still being very cautious about who to release from these places. So
now you're painting a picture, ignore the pun, I didn't actually mean that, of such a rich history. I mean, there's story after story after story that you could keep telling, just drawing your PhD non-fiction research. But we're here to talk about the fact that this is a novel now. And I'm just curious as to, whenever a historical fiction writer writes a novel, they're obviously dealing in facts, and that's what inspires them and motivates them and informs their creative journey as a fiction writer. And then you have to cross that line where you leave the facts a little bit behind and you go forward or sideways or backwards or around in circles in the reimaginings of what else is happening. So I'm really constantly fascinated by that process of the historical fiction writer and the reimagining part, because I'm wondering, how do you know when to reimagine and go forward? But most importantly, perhaps, how do you know when to stop? Because people still want to recognize that this did start with the truth and a real story. So tell us about that for you.
Well, I think it's a very good question, because it sounds difficult, but it's not, if that can make sense. Well, I didn't find it difficult. I think if you really understand the world and what was actually happening at that time, and the sort of things that, particularly in this case, that women were experiencing, it was very easy to slip into that character and try and just constantly stay in her shoes. And I think that's what it felt like. Like, it was like, I can just imagine very clearly what was happening at that time, and what she would have been encountering, and how she might have reacted to that. And she would have been fairly powerless in so many ways, that she would have been a person that probably, if an opportunity cropped up, she would have had to take advantage of it. It would have been very difficult for her at that time to create opportunities for herself. And I think that's something that probably for modern readers, they might struggle with a bit. Why didn't she do more to create her own journey? Whereas at that time, it was particularly difficult for women to do that, because there was a real oppression of the women after the revolution. And it was called the regime of moral order. And there were government spies everywhere keeping a very close watch on women and what they were up to. So that was easy in a sense, because I was just imagining what her circumstances would have been. She would have had this very difficult history that she was trying to keep very hidden, and then trying to move forward in some sort of way and rebuild her life. And for me, as a fiction writer, once I am in, it's almost like an actor in a sense, but once I'm in character, quite often the character guides the story. It's called, I did a bit of interesting stuff on this in my PhD. It's called the illusion of independent agency, which is where your characters actually reach a point in that writing process where they're actually guiding the story. And that was very much the case with this. I also had the benefit of George Moore's memoirs, and he painted such a vivid picture of life at that time in that art world for young students, and what it was like. So being able to inhabit that imaginatively and stay true to what kind of knew about exactly what was happening at that time. Not exactly, no one will ever know exactly, but what I had come to understand was happening at that time. I was able to really let go and let my imagination take the story where it needed to go. I guess that's the only way I can describe it.
I guess informed by their own sort of moral code or whatever, people would look at a painting like that still today, even reading the historical facts and what was happening. And they would still, some people would see a woman posing for a painting like that as, a symbol of oppression, or some would see it as a symbol of empowerment. How did you start viewing it, and what was important for you to make people connect with the character in the book? How did you want them to see her?
I think it's just a practical thing, to be perfectly honest. It was a very practical decision for women and men. It wasn't just women, there was plenty of men too. And at that particular academy, what's in the novel is actually true. They would have their auditions once a week, and you would have a whole stream of everyday people come in who would audition to see if they would make a suitable model, and the art students actually chose their own models. So it was left up to them to decide who they had to sit, and they would be hired generally for about a week. And so you would have people who, needed a bit of money. They were running out of money, so, oh, well, I can go and do that. And, taking off your clothes might have seemed like a very small price to pay if you're very hungry and you've got a family to feed, or, you're the daughter of someone who, is struggling. So I think that's how I viewed it. I think in some levels it probably was confronting for some of these people, the first time they would have had to do it, as I sort of show in the novel. But I don't necessarily think for a lot of people there wouldn't have been a lot of shame or anything like that attached to working in that area. There was a lot of celebrity models at the time who were very much talked about in the press and feted as well. So it could be a very lucrative way of particularly for a young woman, of getting ahead as well.
But I guess people, not everybody would have had the foresight to foresee the end of that, like you know, I'm not going to draw a parallel with sexting, but you know, like your boyfriend says, "Oh, just send me a photo," and you go, "Oh, he's going to see it," and then suddenly he breaks up with you and it's on
exactly.
social media. These models would have just been thinking, oh, really, who's going to see this? A lot of them might have thought it's just the artist, but for somebody like the model who posed for Chloe, suddenly
she knew. Yeah, she would have absolutely known that that was going to be viewed to a huge public at the Paris Salon, and I'm quite sure Lefebvre would have made that quite clear to her.
So what did you want people to take away? I guess, I mean, a PhD is kind of a personal thing. Is the message that you wanted to have people learn from reading your PhD different than the message you want people to connect with in your novelization that the PhD inspired?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think at the end of the day, I think my biggest ambition with this story, both the PhD and with the novel, is to give this young woman a life that has been lost and lost to history. And so many women's lives have been lost to history. And when you think about the impact of that painting and what her image has actually done, and the number of lives that it's touched, is quite extraordinary. And then to know that all that was really known about her was just quite often scandalous myth and things like that. And I think for me, it was really important to try and understand what was her life, what could it have been, and to share that so that people who, I guess, love Chloe, people who don't know about Chloe, they might become curious about it as well. Will look at that painting and maybe imagine other stories as they're looking at it, and also learn more about the lives of a woman from that era and the sort of things and challenges that she had to overcome in order to survive.
I'd like to talk again a bit more about the writing process and crossing that line between the real and imagined, the reimagined. You know, you're talking about there's a point where your characters are guiding you. It sounds a bit like AI is about to take over the world in the novel form, but that's what authors say. The characters come to life and lead them. In your case, is it you sitting in your office, your studio, and you're saying the speech out loud? How do you sort of let the characters inhabit you through that process and guide you?
Yeah, it can be like that. Sometimes I do find myself talking, but most of it's going on in my head when I'm doing the dishes, to be quite honest, or, you know, whatever. It's quite often in those moments when it's a strange way it works. When you're getting the really good stuff, it's quite often when you're thinking about something completely different, it'll suddenly, you have to be that detached, I think, on a cognitive level, on a sort of conscious level, to let the subconscious do the work it has to do. And then it tends to come sometimes just in the middle of the night. You might say, oh my God, that's what's going to happen. That's what needs to happen. And then I'll rush up and grab a pen and jot it all down before it's gone, because that's the gold. It's those moments are the gold in the process. And I guess that's there's different types of writers, I think, and I'm probably more of a pantser. There's pantsers and there's planners. And initially I'm very much a pantser. And then I get all this sort of raw lump of stuff and magic and clay. And then it reaches a point where I think, okay, I've got this, but then how am I going to shape that now into something that's going to be readable and accessible for people who I would love to share the story? Yeah.
And again, I think it comes back down to that thing that I said before. When you're a historical fiction writer, you always must be thinking in the back of your head that you have to stay with those facts. You have to
absolutely, yes. Yeah, exactly.
I feel that that's an inhibitor in a way sometimes, and you want to run away further with the historical fiction side of it, of the story. Well, there's so much rich material in real life that it's more about
yeah, I think I was fortunate with this book because it was just so much material to work with that it was more like running towards it than running away from it. I think, which was exciting. It was, there was just every day you were learning something new and something quite extraordinary about that period.
Now, for everyone who's listening, if they have got a question, now is a great time to make sure you have typed it, even just 1 or 2 questions. I'm sure Katrina would love to hear from you. But while we're waiting to find out if anybody has sent a question or 2 in, I just had another question for you quickly, talking about the novelisation of
Yes.
Chloe, Marie. Tell us about some of the other characters, both real and reimagined, that swirl around your story.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously Jules Lefebvre, I did a lot of work on Jules Lefebvre because he is a historical figure. So I had to make sure I really understood who this man was. And that was really fascinating, to dig into him and find out what a political animal he actually was, which is something that comes as a surprise, because it was an era when artists were meant to keep very hands off in terms of politics, but he was very invested in the Bonapartist regime and had been a favorite of the emperor, and had even been invited to Napoleon III's palace at St. Cloud, had painted his son, the heir to the Bonaparte Empire, and had lived a very privileged life, and yet he had started from a very modest beginning in Amiens, which is actually the same city that the Australian soldiers defended during World War I. So it was a lovely connection there with him, and that's that soldier story as well. George Moore is actually the character Dane in the novel. So I created a pseudonym, which was actually the pseudonym that George Moore himself used in his first memoir, Confessions of a Young Man. So I thought, this is a playful, he was known as the great fictionalizer. So this would be a playful thing to do, use his pseudonym, and then that gives me a little bit of poetic license in terms of how to create his character and his interactions with Marie. And some interesting things about that character are actually true that come up later in the novel that I discovered. And so that was interesting. And then his friend is based on Lewis Weldon Hawkins, who is that's Weldon in the novel. He is a very interesting character based on a real figure as well. So that was fun. And then obviously Marie's mother, Noemi. I did a lot of research into trying to understand what a woman like Noemi would have had to deal with during the Franco-Prussian War and things like the Commune, and how desperate she probably would have become at that time.
And what did you find most shocking about digging into that side of history and the women's experience of that time, especially?
Well, just the complete inequality that they experienced. I mean, they were working basically like slaves and doing the work of men, but getting paid an absolute pittance. So that was really hard for them, very difficult, and quite often having to work very long hours and at the same time trying to raise a family, which is where someone like Louise Michel comes in, because she was actually a headmistress of a school in Montmartre, and she could never take a holiday, because if she did, it meant that the mothers of the children would not have had any care for their children and would have been unable to work and earn a living. So it was a very precarious time in the lives of the women. And they were often viewed with great suspicion as well by the authorities.
And so back to the writing process again, and that transition from the PhD to the fiction. I guess the hard work in a way is the PhD, where you're digging, although you sound like you had some fun and got to travel overseas in the name of reason.
That was rather nice, yes.
Was it a lengthy process, that the writing novel from the PhD? Because I mean, you already had a wealth of facts and stories, which is a great position for any historical fiction writer to start with.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, the novel idea came before the PhD. So as I explained about the dream, I had this idea that because I'd already written a couple of novels at this stage. They were young adult novels. So I was very much in that creative writing, sort of noveling type mode. So it was an absolute luxury to get accepted for the PhD when I put that proposal forward, because it just allowed me that luxury of time to really dig deep into this story and do it justice which would, because I've got a family as well, I've got children, and I would not have been able to do that without, I would have had to be working as well, which I did. I taught at the same time, but it gave me a lot more time to just really lose myself in that history and that story. And it was also looking at, in terms of historical fiction and representation of women and all those different aspects as well. So it goes into a lot of that. And that whole process of creating a fictional novel from something like an artwork. So there's a lot of ekphrasis in it as well. Sorry about the academic terms, but yeah. So, but yeah, no, so it took quite a while. It was on and off, probably the PhD took about 7 years on and off all up, because I had to take breaks because my youngest daughter has special needs. And so there would be times when I had to, obviously be just totally focused on her life and what she was doing. But I got there in the end.
You definitely did.
I got there in the end.
Because you've done a PhD and novel.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
A little bit of a bad person.
Now, Kelly, I don't know if there have been any questions, but I'll check in with you to see.
Yes, we have a question from a patron, Vic, who says, "Thank you for this talk and your wonderful book, Katrina. I have a question on the reception of Chloe in Melbourne. Was our outrage here typical of a reaction that would have happened in European societies as well at that time? Were we in Melbourne more prudish or the opposite about nudity and art in general society?"
So, excellent question. I think probably the closest I can come to answering that accurately is to say I think there probably was more of a cultural cringe in Melbourne at the time. The European cities were a little bit more sophisticated in terms of acceptance of art and things like nudity. The commissioners of the exhibition of 1880, after the exhibition had concluded, said one of the things they put in their report was saying that they felt that the exhibition had educated the population of Victoria in matters that beforehand they were largely ignorant. So I think that probably kind of sums it up. And I think there was a very sophisticated element of the community in Melbourne, but for the majority of the people here, it would have been quite an eye-opener, to put it mildly. Yes, I hope that answers your question.
And we have another question as well from our La Trobe Library's Vicky. And she's asked, are there any other novels published that would sit alongside your novel in terms of similar times in history or uncovering the lives of women in art, paintings, etc.? Anything that you read to help your grounding in that era?
That's definitely a librarian question.
And I like that. It's a very, very good question. Look, there's a beautiful book which is not quite the same, but Richard Flanagan wrote Wanting. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. And that was also inspired by a painting of Mathina, I think her name was. And he also wove different time periods with that one. And that was set in a very similar period, but between Australia and England at the time. So that was useful. And if anyone's interested, I found that a particularly fascinating novel. Of course, there is The Girl with a Pearl Earring, but that's set earlier. And that's obviously Holland. So I did look at that, and I studied that quite closely during my PhD, and the representation in that of the model, which was interesting, but it was a very different type of scenario. I mean, I read widely, not only historical fiction, I read a lot of contemporary fiction as well. So I can't say specifically anything that I can think of that particular era, but I'm sure there would be. So sorry, I can't be more helpful.
Oh, that was a wonderful answer. One novel springs to mind, something that I read last year by a writer, Christopher Moore. It was called Sacre Bleu, and it was solely, it was a wonderful read. It was very adventurous, but it was based on the importance of the muse to the artists or several artists. And so I wanted to share that because that was a fantastic novel that you might like as well.
Yeah.
But just thinking about your work, Katrina, and how the muse, as she was besides being a human in her own right, but the importance and the longevity of her as a muse and all the stories that have woven through the nonfiction of her life and through the dream that came to you. And does the muse, that precious entity there, is that still with you? Is she still with you now that you've completed the novel and moving on to a new stage?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I think she always will be. Very, very much so. It's very hard to let her go because she's been such a huge part of my life for so long. Fortunately, I have another muse who has appeared, and it's going to be another novel very much with a beautiful link between Australia and France, the French and Australian art worlds. So I can't say too much about that one at the moment, but I'm really looking forward to getting my teeth into it.
That's a really exciting news to know, and I can't wait to read Chloe. It just looks incredible. So
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for hosting this lovely talk, and it's been wonderful.
Katrina, I've got one last question, because you've talked about, the way the muse has stayed with you in your own life. I guess a lot of people have their own connection with Chloe because they often see her, at a pub. Maybe they're celebrating, maybe they're marking some sadder commemorative occasion.
Yeah.
And with that comes the way that they view her. Sometimes they're probably just viewing her through the misty eyes of a few beers.
Exactly. Yeah.
What do you say to those people that have maybe just given Chloe a cursory glance, or maybe felt like they've had some deeper connection with her? How now are you hoping that they may still see her differently based on what you've learned about everything that informed that painting and the real woman behind it?
Yeah, and I think you've kind of summed it up really. I would really hope when they look at that painting, they're not just seeing an object, which it is, obviously, it's a painting. But I hope they can see beyond that into the woman that has made this so possible, this beautiful, iconic cultural icon that is such an important part of Melbourne, and the role that she actually has made in that painting. And I think that's one of the things that's really always fascinated me, is that so often the model in a painting is never acknowledged. So many beautiful paintings, we don't know who these people are in the paintings, and yet it's a real talent to be able to be a good artist model. I did a lot of research into that, and there's examples of how talented these particular people were, because they're basically taking on a role. They have to stand for hours on end. It gets very painful. And yet the artist does their amazing work and creates this beautiful thing. But at the end of the day, they wouldn't have been able to do that without that human being who's there. And I think her story is so fascinating, the life she lived through, what she'd experienced. It would be lovely to think people look at that and say, yes, that's a real person behind that painting, and hopefully learn more about her.
And now that people have heard you talk tonight, they'll also be able to see, wow, that's a writer that actually put a lot of years and research and information into sharing this story. So there's always a lot going on behind just what we see on the page or what we see,
Of course.
in a creative pursuit. So you've certainly shown a real dedication to facts, and then going beyond the facts and bringing your own creativity and adding a whole extra layer to the story. So thank you, Katrina Kell. Congratulations on your new novel. Thanks to everybody who's joined us for tonight. Thanks to the libraries who've made this possible. Thank you, Kelly, for overseeing everything. Is there anything you want to say as a sign-off from the library?
Thank you, everybody. Especially thank you to our interviewer, Claire, and Katrina. It's been absolutely thrilling. I was wondering, is your PhD open access anywhere for us to explore that in depth for us nosy Parkers who would love to hear more?
It's actually not, because when I heard about the AI, all the AI business,
of course. Yep.
I actually got my University of embargoed it for the moment, but there is a very interesting article that you can find online that I wrote called Evanescence of an Artist's Model.
Wonderful.
Jules
Wonderful.
Lefebvre's Chloe. So it's Evanescence of an Artist Model, Jules Lefebvre's Chloe, and it was published by Index Journal in Melbourne. And it's
Wonderful.
free access online. And it goes into a lot of stuff I haven't obviously been able to talk about today.
Yeah.
But very happy for people to go and have a look at that too.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. I can't wait to read it, as I said. We've got other little comments, people saying, great chat. Thank you so much, everybody. So, thank you so much for joining us. Sorry about the little hiccup at the beginning. The recording will be made available in the coming week or two, which will be forwarded to everyone who's attended tonight. So thank you all for joining us and supporting your libraries and wonderful authors. And we look forward to catching up with you next time.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Take
Katrina.
care, everybody.
Thanks, Claire. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.